who haven't been lucky enough to have a PC and play through Half-Life, the game that's won over 50 Game of the Year awards over the past several years, Volition and THQ are hooking you up by putting out Red Faction for the PlayStation 2.
Ever since you first Cobra Clutch slammed your shitty sibling's sandcastle, you've known that destruction is just an innate part of your human nature, and games understand this deep-seated desire to destroy and can provide a safe space to reduce things to rubble without ending up on some kind of watch list. And so, in 2001, Volition released Red Faction, a first-person shooter set on Mars whose geomod engine allowed you to rearrange the Martian surface and corporate landmarks to your heart's content. At least, the first two-thirds of the game did anyway. All being said, the level of unscripted destruction that Red Faction can pull off is still impressive. The PC version even released with a bonus glass house map dedicated purely to showing off the technology, and the marketing gets you pretty pumped for blowing up Mars and joining the revolution, even if the trailer feels a little bit... Red Faction would go on to spawn multiple sequels. A year later, Red Faction 2 would release, which had Jason Statham and a cool cover, and nothing else really, and a semi-reboot was released in 2009 in the form of Red Faction Guerrilla, the only game to have marketed itself by inviting people to smash open a car with a sledgehammer in the middle of London to win copies. Other than that, Red Faction had a port to the Nokia N-Gage of all things, and I guess there was Red Faction Armageddon too, but we don't talk about that one. I had completely forgot there was a 2011 movie. That was a part of my memory I didn't expect to be dredging up. It's a Sci-Fi Channel movie, so that should give you an indication of what it's like to watch.
I'm not much of a talker!
Before we start though, there's some fixes that need applying. You can pick up Red Faction on Steam or GOG for about $5 and it will work out of the box, at least it did for me. But if you want it to work in widescreen, then download the Dash Faction fix from the Faction Files website. I'll link it in the description, but it essentially adds widescreen support, fixes some bugs and compatibility issues, and gives you a custom launcher, but also comes with multiplayer support, which I'll get to later. Red Faction has a small but dedicated fan base in the form of the Faction Files community, and the work they do is fucking insane. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You're given the option of completing a training mission akin to the one in Half-Life, which teaches you the basic mechanics of the game before you're thrown into an intro cinematic, where our protagonist Parker gives us his life story monologue about setting off for Mars to look for work.
Life in the mines is hell. I haven't had a minute to myself since I got here. You're jammed 8 to a room, time-sharing your bunks. Conditions are barely livable, and the guards are everywhere.
It turns out Mars isn't all it's cracked up to be, and that the miners there are subject to horrific conditions at the hands of Ultor, the ruthless corporate overlords that run the mining operations on Mars, and you might recognise as being the same megacorporation from the Saints Row games. God, I miss Saints Row 2. If getting their shit kicked in by guards wasn't enough, the mining colony is also suffering the outbreak of a deadly plague for which there is no known cure, and that Eos, one of the voices for dissent on Mars and a revolutionary leader, believes to have been manufactured by Ultor for unknown purposes. You start the game having just finished your shift when you witness a miner being killed by one of the guards. This kickstarts a revolt, and you pick up a stun stick to join the uprising. I guess arming your subjugated underclass with high explosives wasn't such a good idea. As far as presentation goes, Red Faction looks nice. It's certainly dated, but for a game set on Mars, the environments are actually quite varied. You've got mining tunnels, an underground oasis, ice sheets, industrial areas, office complexes, space, and obviously the Martian surface. Though, given that this game is about a miner's revolt, unsurprisingly you spend the majority of the game underground. And while Red Faction absolutely suffers from stale environments now and again, it's varied enough to where you can point to specific areas as being artistically different. In some cases the environment is almost too nice, which I can only guess is a byproduct of the game being set on Mars. The colour scheme is warm. It has to be, which I guess is ironic because Mars is actually a freezing cold hellscape, but the caveman part of my brain will never fully be able to remove that desert equals hot programming. That, and I have a bias because some of my first memories of playing games are from Tatooine levels in Star Wars games, so anything orange and dusty is automatically nostalgic for me. On top of the Martian dust, the office and working spaces of Red Faction feel lived in and dirty. When Parker tells you that living on Mars and working for Ultor was awful, I believed him. A lot of the working areas feel like a Martian gulag, which only makes the shift more strange once you fight your way up to the upper levels and suddenly you're treading your dusty worker boots through lavish corporate offices with marble fountains and carpet. It definitely doesn't have the same level of set pieces that Half-Life does, and absolutely falls into a routine of sending enemies at you down samey hallways, but for a rough-looking budget title, Red Faction is able to pull off a lot with what it has, which is always admirable. It's goofy, sure. You go from a mining complex to an ultra-luxe office to a fucking underwater James Bond research facility, but given that this game takes inspiration from Total Recall, I think you can forgive its campiness. The music is also pretty fitting, with a lot of it having this oppressive industrial feel. The percussion has a bit of a Nine Inch Nails vibe to it, and sound kind of like machinery and gears grinding. And there's usually a low synth drone that sounds like someone fucking an angle grinder in the next room.
help here! Just you and me, Miner.
It definitely gets across the feeling of industry and rebellion, and some of the tracks definitely stand out more than others, but it's a good addition. The weapon models and the texture work is also nicely detailed for 2001, and animations feel responsive and powerful, which is helped by some of the sound design, though there's definitely some weirdness and cheap stuff. The robots making pig noises for one. And they use a lot of stock sound effects for weapons, which isn't anything new. Though I especially like the submachine gun, which has two fire modes. It's basically two submachine guns strapped to each other, and one of them is a higher caliber than the other. So to get the point across, they just pitch shift the same sound down. It works. But on top of that, the AI voice lines are never not funny.
Give up, Miner. Come on, tough guy. You're the guy everyone's after. Heart attack!
The voice acting as a whole is just very weird. It was reminding me a lot of Saturday morning cartoon performances mixed with Silent Hill.
Parker, how nice to see you. I must thank you for starting this little diversion. It has made my work so much easier.
What's that mean, you half-human freak?
Yeah, Parker. Great job. You can pose for pictures later. We gotta keep moving.
Shut up, Weasel. If Eos didn't want you, you'd be dead by now. I'll decide when it's time to go. Okay, let's go. To hell with orders. Die, K-Pack.
Congratulations, Parker. You were the first to see my nanotech shield in action.
You're Griffin, right?
Deputy Administrator Griffin? Yes.
Why do I need your help? I'm the one with the gun.
I have vital information. You must take me to Eos.
What do you know about Eos?
Ultor knows all about her. They set this whole thing up. You must take me to her.
It builds this pulpy atmosphere which only gets more and more over the top, which to be honest helps the pretty weak script. The story to Red Faction doesn't really matter at all. About half the time characters will just talk at you through the radio in between levels, but most of it is just giving you objectives rather than any kind of character development. If anything, Parker is actually kind of a dickhead in cutscenes, what few of them there are, and just seems really whiny half the time, which to be honest makes the in-between sections even stranger, since while Parker might be a cocky arsehole in cutscenes, he remains dead silent everywhere else. And yeah, you might have noticed that some of the animations are a little scuffed here, and you can see through to the mouth model and the eyes. I couldn't figure this one out, sadly. It doesn't appear to be an issue with Dash Faction. Even in a vanilla install this was still happening, so I'll have to put this one down to weird compatibility issues. At its core, Red Faction is a very paint-by-numbers FPS, which isn't a bad thing. Though my key issue with the game is that while the destruction tech it boasts is there, it's more for eye candy than a core mechanic of the game, which is something that Guerrilla would address 8 years later. Yes, you can tunnel through the map with a rocket launcher, and you can blast apart a large percentage of the map, but the actual incentive to use explosive weapons in combat is low. Weapons have zero change in aim when fired, and don't have a whole lot of spread, so it sort of feels like Parker's arm is surgically locked in place and can make combat feel a little stiff. You have seemingly perfect accuracy at mid-range, which is the range that most things in Red Faction are, given the tight spacing of the hallways, and the sniper rifle and the precision rifle have no change in accuracy either for long range, so as long as you're using the scope, wherever your cursor's pointing is where the bullet's gonna go. Though, to be honest, you kind of need it. On harder difficulties, enemies seem to jitter about like a toddler that's been mainlining pixie sticks from an IV, but the AI is also deadly accurate at times, meaning you're losing health constantly, and with later levels giving the enemies the one-shot rail rifle, the AI can gain fucking clairvoyance. What this means is that you're better off using the faster small arms weapons rather than the explosives for speed. There are 4 explosive weapons in the game: a hand grenade, a remote charge, and 2 rocket launchers. For a start, rockets move like they're underwater. It feels like I'm firing a torpedo rather than a rocket, which is interesting considering this game actually has torpedoes in it later that feel better to use. The fusion rocket launcher is useful, as it's basically Red Faction's BFG, which you find very little ammo for but clears rooms in seconds. You also get a grenade that takes slightly too long to arm and slightly too long to explode in its main firing mode, and has an explode on impact alt fire that's a bit more useful despite the fact that Parker throws like the Portuguese Navy. The problem is that when compared against the deadly accuracy and speed of some of the more conventional weapons, explosives just seem a bit of a turn-off, and enemies only ever rarely pack any themselves, meaning that if the area you're fighting in does have destructible environments, you might not even know. There's no collateral damage, which would have been nice to see, but the other issue with that is that not using the explosives isn't a problem anyway, as Red Faction is a game where you can actively see the slow decline in the frequency of destructible environments as you go on. The further you get into the game, the less frequent these areas become, with the first few levels having great destructibility, letting you blast through walls and floors to get the upper hand or discover secrets, but the game culminates in the last few levels having zero destructibility, with explosives leaving nothing but scorch marks, leaving the explosives to go even more unused because it's not as if you're getting any kind of spectacle when you use them. Outside of these 4 explosives, the game gives you the standard FPS arsenal, with a pistol, some machine guns, and longer range weapons like the sniper rifle and the precision rifle, but the real star of the show for me is the rail driver. This fucking thing is like firing a 50 cal in a corn maze. Its scope allows you to see through walls and target enemies, and once fired it will pass through any material in front of it. You can clear whole rooms without even opening the door. Yeah, it's kinda lame that enemies will just stand there while you systematically clear the room of their buddies, but I'll cut it some slack because this thing is just fun to use. It doesn't surprise me that there's a multiplayer mode dedicated solely to using it. The caveat to this is that enemies can also use it with varying levels of accuracy, so you might want to watch out for that. Health and ammo are also plentiful, and you can find them all over the map on enemies and in storage containers, though I would argue that it's a little too plentiful and kind of gives you less of an incentive to explore around. You get armor as well as health, and if your suit gets damaged while outside, you'll start doing your best Quaid impression. Every weapon aside from the flamethrower in the game also has either a scope or an alt fire mapped to the right trigger, with most of them being pretty interesting to use. While I don't like the incentive not to use the explosives, the game makes up for it by pushing through the jank by still giving a fairly solid FPS game where you end up switching between weapons the whole game, except for maybe the pistol and the stun stick, which fall by the wayside fairly quickly. Other than that though, outside of explosives, the standard weapons don't have a redundant entry, and even include some weird shit like the riot shield that blocks bullets so you can skirt around fights and look for ammo. The game's shotgun even has Half-Life's same confusing design by having a Spaz 12 that can fire 2 shots for some reason as an alt fire, so the weapons are fun to use, if a little standard. But sadly the combat won't change much beyond the opening levels, with the game continuing to send standard cannon fodder at you with nothing else. There are boss fights in the game, but 2 of them are a reskin and the other is an annoying puzzle where you have to bait a large robot out into a big burning hole. I know it's an unfair comparison, but Half-Life had great enemy design and implementation, but here the same guards you fight at the start are the same guards you're going to be fighting at the end, just with more armor, and their tactics never really change beyond running at you in a straight line. Though, despite all that, my key issue with the core gameplay is not the combat. Though it does have its problems, Red Faction's main issue for me is its pacing. You might be wondering why the game teaches you how to hide bodies in the tutorial, and why the pistol has a silencer for its alt fire. It's because this game has stealth sections where you go undercover, and they are absolutely shit. The problem with these stealth sections is that they're slow, annoying, and force you to use nothing but the pistol. There's no real autonomy to the way that you can handle things, so you just end up following really obviously telegraphed hiding spaces and cupboards that you can stick taken out guards in. The trouble with this is that with games dedicated to having stealth systems in them, they give you a lot of tools to do that, and for a start the stealth mechanics are actually fun, and have depth to them. In Red Faction you just have to stay far enough distance away from cameras and guards to where they don't get alerted, since you're wearing a disguise. Basically every stealth section is the undercover mission from Thief, but worse.
Thy defeat comes straight with me, my brother.
I understand wanting to pace out your game, but these sections just drag. Thankfully there's only 2 of them, but I have to touch on the second one a little for how weird it is. So, about a quarter ways into the game, you'll disguise yourself as a doctor and make your way through the facility. But you can go on a whole side mission by grabbing a transplanted organ in order to access the administrator's office, whose key you need to get through to the next area. So you grab the organs from the operating theatre, who tell you to take them to the specimen ward. And they tell you to hurry up, even though the organs stay perfectly fine, no matter how long you take to find your way around, so it doesn't really matter. So then you take them to the OR, who tell you to take another specimen to cryogenics. So you do that, but the woman in cryogenics tells you that you need to get an official signature from the administrator. Doing this gets rid of the guards at the entrance, which means you can go up and kill him and take his card finally. Now, what if I told you there was a way to get the key from the administrator without killing him? You have to stand with your gun trained on him for a full 2 minutes of silence before he flops the key down onto the desk. I mean, it's a cool little Easter egg, but why? This quest is just weird. and there's never another one like it in the game. Thankfully, Red Faction's obsession with making you play a half-baked stealth game is rivaled only by its insistence on making you play Descent, which makes sense since Volition started life as Parallax Software. These vehicle sections actually break up the pace of the game quite nicely, and all control really well. It's also here that you get to see a lot of the destruction mechanics take place, since both the submarine, gunship, and tank all have explosive secondary fires. And then of course there's the drill.
Hey, Quay! I'm gonna swash you! Through your...
Overall, the gameplay is basic, but there's nothing too horrendous about it. The AI is pretty janky, and upping the difficulty won't really change how they play that much. And while it does suffer pacing issues, I never felt myself getting bored. While Red Faction's story might be a little thin and frankly goofy, it does achieve a feeling of being part of an uprising. You spend most of the game that isn't the stealth sections running around and causing chaos for Ultor. The rest of this is going to be spoiler territory, so if you really want to see this for yourself, then skip ahead to here. The problem with Red Faction's story is that all of the characters in Red Faction are forgettable cutouts or cartoon villains. You have Eos, the leader of the Red Faction, who appears to be wearing half a child's Power Ranger mask, and whose sole purpose is yelling at you to go faster over the radio. Hendrix, your hacker on the inside, who guides you through the radio and gets a big dramatic death scene despite having no real character development, and whose death you can miss because it happens in the corner of a large hangar while a big fight is going down. And Parker, who outside of cutscenes is mostly silent, and in them is kind of a dick and becomes a wannabe James Bond action hero out of nowhere. There's technically two antagonists to Red Faction, though I don't think the last one really counts. My favourite character in the game has to be Capek though. Not only does he look like a Poundland tech priest, but he also has this Orson Welles He-Man villain thing going on. You kill Capek about halfway through the game though, so they bring in the Merc Commander Masako later, and she just comes and goes. But for some reason, she's the final boss. You hear about her once, and then you blast through a Merc base with a gunship, blast her out of hers, she does the exact same floating around the room bullshit that Capek does, and then you one-shot her with the rail rifle. The button to take you to the end of the game is in the room where you fight her. I've seen lackluster final boss fights before, but this is just odd. It's a character we're barely introduced to and who's gone in seconds. You defuse a bomb by playing Simon Says, Eos shoots down Parker for being creepy, and the EDF come to the rescue, which, if you've played any of the later games, makes this a bit of a bittersweet ending. If you're playing Red Faction for the story, then you're going to be disappointed, though I don't think the game was trying to hide the fact that its story is only marginally better than something you'd find in an episode of Power Rangers. Actually, some of the Power Rangers episodes were pretty sick, I take that back. It's a game about blowing stuff up, and for the most part it succeeds at that, though I can't really recommend it for that either, because the destructibility draw only dissipates as you play further. It's dated, sure, but it has that charm to it that could only come from an early 2000s budget FPS, so whether that's enough to keep you going will depend on what you're into. What I will recommend it for, though, is the revived multiplayer and the continuing community that it's generated. I reached out to Goober, one of the founding members of Faction Files, who was nice enough to talk to me about the community and its history. Faction Files has been going since 2009, and they are insanely dedicated, supporting anything from mod development to speedrunning, and the level of support they give out is ridiculous. The Faction Files Discord, which I'll link in the description, is hosting game nights on the weekends right now, and the community is really welcoming. Just start watching now and go check out the Discord. While you're at it, check out Goober's channel too, which I'll also link. He posts everything from mods and community content to game night promos, multiplayer highlights, speedruns, cut content, and promotional materials. He titles some of his videos with Red Faction Historian, and I tend to agree.
I like Red Faction so much, in fact, that I've actually collected pretty much every version of the game that was ever produced. I mean, I've got the Taiwanese box version of the game here. I've got the Russian bootleg copy of the game here. So yeah, I've done some collecting. I actually own 2 N-Gages, so I could play Red Faction N-Gage multiplayer. There's Bluetooth multiplayer on these things, so yeah, I'm that guy.
This is one dedicated guy, and to be honest, I can imagine that in the desert wasteland of the far future, the descendants of these guys will be giving out Red Faction mods through post-apocalyptic theatre performance or something. It'll be interpretive, sure, but there's no way they're letting people not know that Red Faction existed.
As with sonar, the big problem with detection is interpreting the returning signals. All aircraft carry an electronic gizmo called IFF, identification red.
Hey, you hear that? The guards are coming. For you.